Today, we're thrilled to present Picturing Punk, the legacy of Mark Morrisroe, featuring Beatrix, the director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Jack Pierson, an artist, and Linda Yablonsky, an art critic and journalist who writes for Artforum, among many other outlets. The program is presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm Linda. This is Jack and Beatrix. These lights are really blinding, and I can't see anything. So just...
That makes it better.
It's like night driving. We are going to talk about Mark Morrisroe, and among other things. And I would like to ask, even though I can barely see anyone, how many of you here, just to get an idea, know who Mark was? Oh, so we're not starting from scratch. Most people don't, and that's partly what we're going to be talking about too, is artist legacies, in particular his, and who he was and what kind of work he made. Okay, so Jack is here partly because he's a very good artist, and partly because he had an intimate relationship with Mark Morrisroe when they were very young, and can speak to his beginnings as an artist and what kind of life he had. And his life actually does enter into both his work and this discussion. You'll see Jack actually in a lot of these pictures. I have to say that we haven't seen this before, so I don't actually know what's coming up or in what order, so we'll just improvise a little bit. These are, so Mark was identified as something that later came to be known as the Boston School, a group of artists who in the 70s either went to school together or knew each other and kind of came to New York more or less at the same time, except for Mark, who came later. He had a kind of hardscrabble early life. That's correct, right?
Yeah. Yes.
He never knew who his father was, although he claimed to be the son of the Boston Strangler, which sounded very good and wasn't that far-fetched, I guess. That man, Albert DeSalvo, who was the Boston Strangler, was actually his mother's landlord. And Mark was a bit of a, I guess, unhappy kid, or rebellious in any case, and independent-minded, always restlessly creative. When he was a kid, he wanted to make films, and to finance the films, partly to finance the films, he hired himself out as a teenage prostitute. One of his Johns shot him in the back, did some damage to his spine, and so he had a physical disability for the rest of his very short life. Had a pronounced limp, which kept him, in a way, later on in the darkroom, doing some very interesting things with his pictures. When did you meet him? At what point?
I met him in Boston in 1980, and at that point he was known as Mark Dirt almost exclusively, or was actually on the cusp of phasing that out, because he had been kind of the most notorious punk in Boston, and published a zine called Dirt Magazine, and he and his girlfriend at that time, Linnell, were just known as the Dirt, sort of Linnell Dirt and Mark Dirt. And he was always, like, you know, they did this at 16, and if you see the magazine and read it, the writing is incredibly funny and sophisticated for 16-year-olds in Boston. And but he was a very scary sort of proposition. Like he lived up to the name, but at the moment I met him, he was making a conscious effort to sort of go, like, whatever normative or something. Like he was reading this book, Dress for Success. So now he would eschew punk clothing and wear white shirts and a red tie, and he tried to follow all the things that it said in this book, Dress for Success. So I got him at a transitional moment, and I think part of my appeal was that I was like this kid from, whatever, south of Boston, sort of, not South Boston, but, a kid from the country, and I was like the opposite of that, kind of, like, just like off the farm, sort of, and I think it served him to just try to get a little bit of normal realness somehow.
I don't know if do we have any pictures of the Dirt magazine? Any pages in this slide?
Maybe you do take my stick
Because
again.
they're amazing. To see it now, I mean, they're artworks, really, and they're very hard to find, and they're very expensive if you do find them.
Well, they reissued a really nice reissue by
really?
that guy Rafael Sanchez.
Oh,
I
I
think
didn't know that.
published them all as a reissue. But they used to be like a little traditional zine, 1975, and hand painted and real Xeroxy.
Well, now, these days, a lot of artists are making zines, but he really stepped up to the plate
that was
pretty
a pretty
early.
cutting edge one pretty early on.
What?
I said that was a cutting edge one pretty early on.
Cutting edge.
Or cutting edge, whatever.
And it was very funny. And
It's hysterical even now if you read it, even
Yes.
if you don't know who. It's mostly celebrity driven and talks about stars as though he has the inside tip on them, and it's just all made up gossip.
did he always want to be an artist? I mean, he started so young, and then he started making films.
I think he really did. I mean, he had real aspirations / delusions. Like he would have taken fame in any form. Do you know what I mean? And
He wanted to be famous.
he wanted to be
for sure.
famous more than anything else. So I think, he would have, whatever it took, he wanted to be famous.
Who was his inspiration? I mean, what inspired this
At the
lust
moment
for
I
fame?
met him, it was John Waters, sort of.
Oh.
That was another, like, once he got off the Dress for Success kick, we morphed into the John Waters kind of published his first book called Shock Value, which gave sort of the recipe for making exploitation movies. So that was the next phase. And The Laziest Girl in Town, which is a film he made, was kind of based on that recipe that John Waters said, like, you've got to have this, you got to have that, you got to have a drag queen, you got to have some puke, here's how you make the puke, da-da-da-da, and we followed that recipe to make that movie.
There's 3 films we would find in the archive,
Yes.
like Laziest Girl in Town, Nymphomaniac, and the third one, Hello from Bertha.
Oh, right, yeah. Hello
And
from Bertha.
I think you featured in all 3 of them.
No, I'm only
No?
in 2. I'm not a nymphomaniac.
Oh.
That was a really bad one. But there were films, like, he was, rotten early on, sort of. Like, there's the first famous film that was sort of suppressed and was part of Pat Hearn. Pat Hearn was his art dealer and our friend at the same time. Had a TV show on cable, or just the cable TV for
Yes.
MIT.
Yes, we should. In Boston, there was this Boston school, which was Nan Golden and David Armstrong. Philip Lorca de Corsia was not really part of the group.
It didn't
but he
really
was-
exist. The group didn't really exist. You understand?
Yeah,
of course.
but there was this loose community of friends.
Or
who-
lineage, I would say.
Lineage? That's
Yeah.
a good word. And there was a kind of element of the sexual underground to this, of cross-dressing or drag, what we now call trans, I suppose. Oh, there's a
Oh yeah,
page
that's what
from
Dirt
Dirt.
looked like.
And an involvement of the clubs, and some of his photographs, you'll see the same people in drag, including Mark himself and out. But Pat Hearn was an artist in Boston who performed in this TV show that she had a cable access show, more or less, from MIT. I think she was in a band with George Condo, and was probably Mark Morrisroe's greatest champion as an artist. She moved to New York and she opened a gallery on the Lower East Side in the early 80s and became one of the most important art dealers, at least in my mind, in the 80s and 90s. She died of liver cancer in 2000. But until that time, she was the only one who was showing Mark and really kind of supporting him. But she had this history in Boston as well. So he was on the TV show?
Yeah, there was a TV show, a cable access show called The Pat Hearn Show, and you know, MIT had all the like Montadas and people like that, so it was a serious deal. But he got the stuff that you put cats to sleep with, and had a cat that needed to be put to sleep, and he did it like on live TV, dressed as a punk. So it was like a inter-Bostonal incident, sort of like it was a big shocking thing somehow, even though it's kind of touching and tragic, and you know the cow was going to die anyway, but it was you know, it was part of the legend that made you afraid of him. Somehow, that's the guy that killed the cat on TV. You know.
But there were a lot of experiments going on at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it was the punk, like, especially, and this is 1975, 1976 now. If you blew that up to 4'5" and stretched it on a canvas, you could sell it out there for $350,000, I would think. Because, I don't know, like, it's even punker than punk, I think.
Can you click a bit?
But this, also what you're seeing is, what makes it partially fascinating is that this is the actual layout. This is an actual, it's not just the Xerox, it's the handmade thing that they Xerox from, so you get all this discoloration. It wasn't a 4-color thing at the time.
When did he start doing photography?
Good question. He went to museum school, which was the fancy art school in Boston.
How did he do that?
Because he even, I don't know whether, like, either it was because of the disability or his situation as a teenage impoverished person. There were a certain amount of scholarships available, and he was quite talented, and people, like, you know, there was a recognizable talent, and therefore he had a scholarship, and I don't know how much was paid by maybe Social Security or just a good program for talented poor kids.
So
But he went to museum school,
right,
and what was I saying? I forget what the question was.
when he started doing photography.
Oh, he started doing, you know, he had foundation courses. When you go to art school, you have a little of this and a little of that, and he picked a camera and seemed well-versed at that and got involved more and more with the camera. But he kind of made paintings all the way along, too. He made a lot of stuff, but the camera became more and more a focus for him.
So he made portraits of his friends, and many self-portraits.
Yeah.
But they're not just pictures. He did things to the pictures. He wrote on them. It was his printing techniques that he experimented with the most, and which really are.
Yeah, so
what's
these are early
striking.
pictures of his,
Yes.
say. Like, early, like, he picks up a camera. They're fairly traditional, except for maybe the subject matter. The printing is, you know, like, he's trying to be a good photographer, color photographs. There's not a lot of technique going on. I mean, it's technically good and perfectly good, but what he added when the first ones we were seeing that were more spotted and decayed looking and had writing all around them, that was something that came later, that he
And-
developed over time.
Maybe if you go down a bit, and you can also click in a PDF. The actual first show he did in the Boston was the 11th Hour. We played with black and white photography.
Yes, exactly.
This pattern.
No, this is a woman named Penelope. That's him
No,
in the...
she was in the image before.
Yeah, okay.
That's Mark.
That was Mark. That's
Pat. Yeah.
Here. This is his friend Linnell that, made Dirt Magazine with him and was like his lifelong childhood. She sort of grew up in the neighborhood and was around him his whole life. She's still around someplace in the desert. And P.S., do you know that painting is by Gail Thacker?
The
the
painting
background.
behind her.
Yeah.
Gail Thacker. That's Pat
This is
Hearn.
Pat Hearn.
In her punk face. There is two paintings of Pat hanging right now in the Art Institute of Chicago that made by Andy Warhol. Pat Hearn nudes. They're beautiful, outstanding paintings.
Yeah. So a very important medium was Polaroids because he had a contract with the Polaroid company. So
Yeah. So how did
had
that happen?
access-
The contract. He had a contract with Polaroid.
Well, it wasn't a contract. There was a man named Elko Wolf, who was sort of the liaison to the arts community, because Polaroid was in Cambridge or around
Oh, I
Boston,
see.
right?
Yeah.
So they had a program to provide Polaroid film for worthy artists that wanted to make work with Polaroids, and Mark was worthy and charismatic, so he really worked Elko Wolf for as much film as he could get.
So it strikes me that a lot of people recognized his talent early on.
Yeah, because it was visible. Or,
Yes, it was always visible, and yet many people never saw it. So I'd like to talk about how that happened, or why.
Well, I don't know. It was hard. People didn't.
Was it his personality?
No, because his personality was fairly charming, I think.
Charismatic. you said.
Charismatic, in as much as that it could be scary, but there was nothing that would prevent at least entering the door. He charmed a lot of people. But at that time, Polaroids weren't a thing. Like
Right.
now we've had books this thick of every single person's photographs, Polaroids that ever saved them. You know what I mean? So they're a thing, and Warhol made Polaroids a thing, and da-da-da. But at the time, it was sort of like, oh, okay, well, these are nice, but they're this big, sort of. So, and they're a Polaroid, and my dad used to take, I don't know, you know what I mean? I don't think it was a cabal that, you know what I mean? I think now we're prepared to see practically anybody's Polaroids as like, wow. And his are great at the time, and photography wasn't as embraced then, really.
That's true.
You know what I mean?
That didn't happen
Like
till
he was
later.
working against it,
down.
and especially photography that.
Mr. Pierson.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Don't.
there
It's
you
too
are.
sad. It was just not. But Diane Arbus had barely broken at that moment. Like she was the only one that seemed like made pictures like Mark, and so there was some kind of, I don't know, possibility for that reason.
But
Go
you made
through to
photo-
the next series, please.
You made photographs too. I mean, you make sculpture and
Yeah, but
Many
we're
things,
talking
but-
now about the early 80s. I didn't have my first show of photographs till the 90s, and we had been well prepped since 85 to 90 to embrace
Oh.
photography by Cindy Sherman, by Richard, you know what I mean? Like photography was a thing that could then be embraced, but like those little year increments make a lot of difference, I think, in how people are embraced.
so when did you moved to New York in what year?
83,
And Mark
probably
arrived?
85 maybe. He stayed behind a couple of years. He was kind of afraid of New York because, like Linda introduced, like he had, like, the limp was not just like a little limp. It was a thing in the, you know, you felt it, sort of. So I don't think we all moved to the East Village, and it was, you know, whatever it was, like dangerous and exciting. And I think he felt too, even though he was dangerous and exciting, felt too vulnerable in that context somehow.
So he kind of arrived when the East Village art scene was dying, and everything was moving back to Soho. And he didn't actually live in New York also, so he kind of isolated himself by taking an apartment, a cold water flat basically, in Jersey City or something.
Which Jersey City is now kind of okay, but
Yes,
at that
but
point it was much more
it was
radical.
Siberia.
Yeah, it was Siberia.
And no one went there, and no one knew anyone who came from there. But it was Philip Taft's studio. Philip Taft was one of Pat Hearn's artists, now a very well-known painter. And Mark moved in there, I guess, kind of free. He barely had to pay any rent.
Oh, I
I
didn't know
think-
this whole part. Not the first, when he
yeah.
first moved there, I think. Maybe he was nearby, but I think there was a little rent being paid. But I think Pat paid his rent a lot.
Yes, I think she did. But she didn't give him a show until after his death, really. Right?
Yeah, there
No, there was a
there
show
was
in
a show.
There was a show
1988.
in the East
There was
Village.
a show, yeah.
Yeah. 88, there was a show. 88.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was
So yeah, I would say
otherwise
3 years
occupied.
after, and he died in what, 89?
89.
He died a year later
Yeah.
of AIDS. And in that, so what happened in between? So he kept on working in this apartment that he had in Jersey City. He built a darkroom. And that's when I think he really developed as as the artist he was meant to become. And somebody with that kind of creative energy and focus, absolute dedication to what he was doing. I mean, if he had survived, I don't know, he would be one of our leading artists today, I'm quite sure. So all we have is this archive of his photographs and his 3 films, Super 8 films, and the magazines. And we have that available. This is where Beatrix comes in very instrumentally in preserving his legacy. What was the first time did you see that show in '88?
No, but the 94 show I saw.
The '94 show.
Yeah,
That was the
so there were
first
two.
time I saw his
Yeah.
work in '94.
Yeah, that was at Pattern then already
in Soho.
in
yeah.
Soho. And and then there was another show, 99, but actually since 94 we continuously kept talking. She was very hesitant actually to even sell the work. You remember that? Really, there was not much, it was very, kind of almost controlled of where this work can go, how it can leave the galleries. There were 3 shows, she did in even having been so close to him and so instrumental also for his career. So it was quite amazing actually how that how secretive almost that was handled. And when Pat died 2000
No, it was
yeah.
late.
No, it was 2000.
2000? I think
No?
It was 2002.
No,
I think
I don't
it
know.
was
Anyway.
2000.
She's badly missed still.
Then that as a private estate thing, this went to Colin DeLand. The estate of Mark
Yes.
Morrisroe went to Colin DeLand, who died 3 years later. And from 2000 to 2002, we were speaking a lot because he was wondering. He considered that as a private, responsibility is taken on. So he would not do shows. He would not even consider sales, and he was wondering how to keep that as a legacy for not only Mark Morrisroe but also I think it was very private for him. and 2002, we had a very long conversation, and then in one afternoon, basically it was decided that the Ringier collection would purchase the estate, place it as a deposit in the Photo Museum Winter Tour, and that in that year until his also much too early death, this became a reality. And 2004, then the whole, everything, all the boxes, everything that was also in New Jersey. There was still the room in New Jersey where they started to inventorize the work, but never was finished. Much too hot. It was like very, like climate-wise, very, very difficult for photographic, particularly for Polaroids. All of that was shipped in boxes to the Photo Museum in Winterthur. And until the show, you came to Winterthur to as well. In 2010, the work really was inventorized. Everything has been looked at. The films were digitalized. There's a lot of material still, which is not fully, particularly in the film, fully identified. All the Polaroids were secured, and then we did that show 2010, and this catalog, which also went to Artist Space in New York.
Very little of his work had found its way to collectors up to that point. So almost he made a lot of work considering the short span of time in which all of this happened. At the end of his life, he was basically working with the x-rays of his lungs because that was the subject matter he had at hand. And he made amazing images. He also, we should say something about his sandwich prints, because that was one innovation of his, of this print overlaying images, or melding them together, actually. And
this is actually the sandwich print.
This is a sandwich print.
Where he usually used two, used several, how do you call that? I don't even know. Negatives and overlaid them. Are too much more knowledgeable. This is not a sandwich. This is a sandwich. It's not a sandwich.
That is too, because he went back and did some of the. What happened one day when he was making the other prints that were supposed to look a certain way and kind of fine, he had an underexposed frame that he really liked. And so there was maybe a teacher told him, one way you could bring back some information to it is to make a black and white internegative. And that would provide some contrast and some detail. And so he did that, and you had to line up the two negatives together and print through them. And when he did that, it didn't come out anything like, oh, you could blend this in with the rest, but it came out with a kind of quality like that somehow. And which was sort of romantic and hazy and sort of had the effect and appeal of a lot of the photography we would all see at the MFA in Boston, which was like Henry Fox Talbot and people like that, like real pictorial people somehow. So he went back then, having mastered this technique sort of, he went back and maybe did earlier work like that, but also continued to do it. But it fundamentally had a lot of, there were a lot of things that could go wrong. There was twice as many areas to get scratched or dust on. The alignment had to be precise. Color printing at that time was like baking a cake in the dark. I mean, I have students today that'll be like, oh, I did a color print one. It's really hard. You have to do it all in the dark and then put it in a slot in the wall. And it's really hard. And I was like, well, let me tell you something. It used to be harder than that. There was no slot in the wall, so it was a really hard thing. But fortunately, he also found a technique that was kind of forgiving. Like, he wasn't trying to print out editions that looked exactly alike. And in fact, part of the reason it seems like there's a lot of work, but there's not a lot of work out there, is most of these editions were never printed fully. Like, it may say 1 of 10, but that just meant
there's one.
there was going to be 9 more when he had the money or the need for it.
But there is actually, and I think we spoke about that when we looked at the material in winter tour. There's a lot. Often it's numbered 1 from 12, and maybe there is 6 prints, and then you don't.
Right.
There might be a few circling already.
Yeah.
But some are, like framed with the writing, with the notes, and the contextualization you did with the text or with scribbling on them, and some are not.
Right.
So we have Beatrix to thank for negotiating the sale of the archive to a responsible collector, the publisher, Michael Ringier, and its subsequent exhibition at the Photo Museum Winterthur, and then again at Artist Space in New York, which was a revelation to many people who saw it. But now what happens? And here's the archive. It's in Europe, and I think this is a big issue for artists today, since the internet, and conservation is a big issue, and inventorying the work and what happens to it when you're gone, who's going to be responsible for it. We have, because the art market in contemporary art today is so voracious, we have a lot of commercial dealers and curators, younger curators who are rediscovering older artists who have studios full of work that no one's ever seen or hasn't seen since the 70s or the 60s. And they're the lucky ones, so they're getting shown now and their work is being archived, but most artists can't afford to do that for themselves. And this work is generally worth a lot of, I won't say generally, a lot of this work is worth preserving and being seen. So what happens? Now, Beatrix, you told me you've worked very hard to make a foundation,
Yeah,
the Mark
this is-
Morrisroe Foundation.
But this is in the process. Unfortunately, it takes longer than planned, because when we did the shows 2010 and 11, the foundation should have been in place already. Still takes time. Foundations sometimes take a long time, and that was already agreed with Colin, that there will be like basically a core group, like 100 of the sandwich prints, the Polaroids, plus the experiments he has been doing with prints, with cyanotype prints, but also the X-ray photography and prints he did from that, which will never leave the foundation, but there will be a presence in the market again once this is decided and through, because the work has to be seen, and the only idea of that is that this is feeding back into the foundation over the long run of time.
I do think it fits into a very particular history in the 80s art, and this was an important moment for photography becoming accepted as a fine art category and worth collecting. And also, he did things other people didn't do, working with what we now think, as Jack just mentioned, with primitive material, primitive processes, or actually the same old classical processes, but that have disappeared. So it definitely needs preserving, and I think it belongs in museum collections. I'd like to see it there myself. I know the first time
It is.
I remember Pat Hearn, who was one of the founders of the Armory Show, the art fair in New York. At the very first Armory Show, that's what she had to sell, was Mark's Polaroids. That's all she was selling in her booth, which at the first Armory Show, they were kind of small booths. It was,
People bought them, as I recall, no?
yeah, she was selling them for $1,000 a piece, I think, which was a high price for a Polaroid,
Yeah.
even in the early 90s. And but they were amazing. I mean, it was that's all I remember from that Armory Show, was her booth and those pictures.
Huh.
and it really stands out in my memory. And that's really what got me interested in him in the beginning, because I never met him.
But maybe, Jack, you have to talk about it, because this is a Polaroid technique where you actually can make copies from, you know? It's not this sealed in Polaroid process. You get a negative and a positive. And Morrisroe experimented a lot with that, as you can see here with the color plays he did, the series we went just through. He did larger prints from Polaroid
He
negatives.
had a kind
you
of
know?
Polaroid film that would make a negative.
Yeah.
Which many people had at that time. I can't think of a famous one but like, you know, people were using that. And so he could preserve the negative, and maybe if you were anal retentive, you would try to get it really perfect, but he would just fuck it up and like wreck them, sort of, so that they would begin to have, these are actual Polaroid prints, but I imagine eventually there'll be a print made from a Polaroid negative that you've seen before, has all these drippy lines around the edge and like that. So he was very experimental, and I don't know, like I don't have a big problem with him not being embraced in his lifetime somehow. Like, that would have been great. It seemed like he was pretty happy with the attention he got and that he had shows at Penn Harbor, but it is the kind of work that you want to find later.
I think
Somehow, you know what I mean? It's like Pierre Molyneux or something. Like, you want to hear about it. You want it, like, even as much as he wanted to be famous, he didn't really know how to go about it somehow. And he was more like a crazy person in a cold water flat making work than he was. Like, he aspired to be Keith Haring or Jean-Michel Basquiat or something, but he wasn't really one of those people. Somehow he wasn't.
But he was their contemporary.
He was their contemporary, but you know what I mean? Like, in as much as he had all this ego and ferocity, he wasn't, I don't know.
Was that, I mean, there was a lot of role playing, dressing up, I mean, particularly in the films you can see it, but it seems all very much directed towards a private context.
Yeah, it's kind of like almost, I feel like we made them to entertain ourselves. I mean, that's how I felt like what it was about. I do think he thought they were going to be like Andy Warhol movies or something, and I never really saw that, even with the finished result, like, because I was like, nobody's going to go see this, but, you know, they're kind of fun to watch now. I never know whether they're fun because I remember it or whether they're actually fun for people seeing, but it seems like people like them. This one's touched. The Hello from Bertha, which is, you know, based on a Tennessee Williams one act, is pretty touching, I think, especially me.
Well, Jack, you think about your legacy?
I don't really.
Having this example in your life?
I feel like, you know, you get some stuff in print, it's around. I don't really care.
You don't
Once
care
you're
what
dead, you're
happens to your
dead. Like,
work?
yeah, no, I have no interest in it. I've made my will already. There's no foundation. There's no nothing. Throw it all the fuck away. I could really care less.
And well,
You know, I imagine if somebody, you know, like, and I also have enough ego, like, it'll get around, you know, like, people. I don't have any need to preserve and protect the legacy of my, you know, whatever achievement somehow.
But also things have changed a lot, you know, like the professionalization of the gallery systems and the art.
Yeah, sure, that's what I mean. Like, so maybe somebody will do it if they want to, but I think he'd be pretty happy with this. There's a beautiful book about this thick.
Yeah.
You know, I don't, like, there's no problem for me with his legacy. Like, but, you know, I don't know.
Well, what ultimately do you, I'm going to ask the same question of both of you, and then see if anybody else has questions. What, for you, is essentially the legacy of Mark Morrisroe? to other artists, to history?
Well, I think it speaks it's a story of someone who, against all odds, created something great.
Yeah.
That's a story we all like.
Sure
And
is.
if you're an outcast, and that's part of the story, I think he's probably still speaking to an outcast milieu on a certain level, or people that are wanting to cast themselves in somehow. I don't know. And so he made these glorious things. He was like, you know, I don't know, they're beautiful, they're art, it's like he made some really nice, pretty pictures, and you wouldn't have thought so, because there was nothing going in his favor, really, all the way
Yes.
along.
What about for you, Beatrix?
Yeah, I totally agree. I said I was almost fascinating with the work. I found it very special, also very personal, intimate, and very experimental. You can flip through there, you just see all these experiments he was involved with. But I think there's a bigger question to it, and it actually had been touched by the, like Hans Ulrich and David Frigley's talk about archives, and the question, what happens with all our physical archives? Is that, how do we deal with them, and how do artists also think about their physical archives? You said you don't care, but I'm not so sure if you don't care. I don't think that things that have spoken to a public or an audience in the broadest sense, but also spoken to the artist, him or herself. There is a question: how is that continued? Who takes care of it? Where do they land? Museums usually don't like to acquire archives. Like basically this collection bought an archive and put it in the museum. But also that made it easier for the museum because all the inventorizing, caretaking is being done like in
In-house.
addition to the museum system. But acquiring archives, taking care of estates, is something museums think about a lot because it really is changing the functioning of the inner museum structure. So the question is, where do all those archives go? What are they? Who decides? What is the essence? What is dispersed? What is kept together?
That's a good question.
Well,
decides?
except that we know the answer. It's
What?
decided by if it's worth money.
The market. Yeah,
Somebody
I think so,
takes
too.
care with it, and if it doesn't, they don't. And so it's pretty nice that Mark Morrisroe's isn't really even now worth money. But Beatrix sort of ushered this. It is being housed by a beautiful photography museum in Winterthur. And when I went there, I couldn't help but think, like, these ratty fucking photographs are sitting all over the floor of every apartment I ever lived in. And now they're being treated with kid gloves in like mist with temperatures and rolling steel walls and all this kind of stuff. So
Frozen.
you know what I mean? And like, oh, please, no, don't touch that. And I'm like, I've touched this a million times. You know what I mean? Like, so I think for me, his archive is okay. It's set, and it will continue to grow or not. And like Beatrix says, like, they need to get stuff into the marketplace. That's what makes a archive grow or flourish. And the more work you have to sell, the more you'll be famous after death. He didn't have that. He didn't have that option. And I can tell you, because I was there, and as were you, a lot of archives of artists working with AIDS went in the trash next day.
That's why I'm bringing this up.
So, I mean, he was a lucky one. He had Pat, he had this. I'm not saying there were, and maybe that wasn't as genius as this, but it's pretty lucky that this escaped that sort of Holocaust, we'll call it, and was preserved.
Yeah, next year at the next expo, maybe we'll see some on the walls of somebody's stand here at Expo.
But I
Chicago.
also think it's, it's not the most important thing. You
No,
know what I mean?
I think it's
Books
a-
are the most important thing for
I was just
photography.
going to say the same thing. There is the catalog of the show from the Photo Museum. Pat Hearn also did a book, beautiful book.
Oh, yeah,
from
sure.
her first show that she did, the '94 show. And books, like we say in publishing, books have long legs, and they'll take the work far. And as long as we keep them available. And I think that catalog is, I have an essay in it, and I'm not saying this because of that, but it's fantastic.
It is
It is the
fantastic.
whole history and the life and the times and the work. And if you can get hold of it, I recommend it.
It's
I'd
widely
like to take-
available. It's Ringier
Yes,
that publishes
it's
it?
Yes,
Gia
it's in
Pierson.
art, where you find our books. Yes, hi.
We have microphones.
Can you hear me okay? Hi, all right, hi. I just walked in late, but this looks really interesting to me. And a question I have is, when artwork and archives of artwork depend on markets in order for them to survive or thrive, right? What do you think is the downside of that? I mean, I really appreciate the way that you guys have set up the whole paradigm around your friend's work, right? And the fact that, and the point that you made about it being personal, right? Not that he was going for a market necessarily or commercial or whatever. But what happens to art when those are the two things that we have available, right? Either you're in the market or you're not, right? Either your stuff gets preserved because the market has lauded it or it doesn't.
No, I think Jack said it very clearly. Mark Morrisroe wanted to become famous. He has a very clear intention. So,
No, I'll try to answer. What's the downside of work only being preserved if it's embraced by the market? Right, but that's, there's no danger. It's capitalism, unfortunately. But, there are happy little moments of that not occurring. Like I saw a show in Provincetown this summer, and there's a guy there, a gallerist, that's making it a point to find people. And there's a brilliant gallerist, perhaps the best gallery you could visit in New York City, bar none, is a place called Mitchell Algus Gallery. Mitchell was an artist at Pat Hearn's gallery, and he makes it a point to look at art magazines from 1964, 1956, look, this person had a full-page ad. Where are they now? And he finds that and brings it forward and shows it. And guess what? Nobody buys it. It's work that looks just as good as the 24-year-old next door.
Amazing work.
Amazing work. Not interested. Dead. Old. Ugh. 24-year-old next door. Cool. We love it. Like if Mark was alive today and 24, he'd be embraced, believe me, because that's what people want. You know what I mean? Like a bad boy is like, this. Yes, come to my dinner party and pee in my fireplace. They want it. But at that time they didn't. There wasn't even a market in the 80s like that. But unfortunately, you just never know. But somebody can go to Clear Lake, Iowa and find some old guy that's been working his whole life, and maybe if they bring it to the marketplace and it flies, that guy gets famous. You know what I mean? It's all if it flies, or if somebody can make it fly. Or you wait somehow. Or it just goes in the trash, unfortunately. I don't think there's anything wrong with any of those.
I was living in Boston in the early 80s, and I was very poor, and I just want to ask if things like the ICA, where I could go for almost no money and just spend the whole day looking at videos, was important to artists, or is that just my bad memory of that period?
Yeah, I feel, well, what part of the early 80s? Like, yeah, we went to the ICA because it was free, but not to really hang out. I mean, had BFVF that we worked in and out of a little bit, the Boston Film Video Foundation, the museum like that. I mean, part of the other thing I was going to say about being in Boston for young people, which all the young people left, you know, when you're in a town that's not central, you sort of have to create your own activity. So you make a movie that makes it feel like you're in the Warhol factory. You do all these things to fill up the void of being in a smaller or secondary city or something. You know what I mean? So.
What did he say about his work when he was doing it? Did he say, oh, I did this cool image, or I've got to see what happened with the color, I want to try that some more? Or was he kind of working systematically? Did he get enthusiasms and then they would peter out? Or did he say, I've got to take many pictures of this person? You know, what was he saying about the work?
He would, basically that he was a genius and this was the greatest work that had ever been made. And, you know, you can only hope to make work as good as this. And if you know, you probably never, you will never, but here I'll teach you how to do this maybe. Like, I never knew I've tried to do this isn't a sandwich one, but I tried to copy it once and I couldn't figure it out, so I never learned well enough from him. But he was pretty impressed with his own, and he was systematic and he worked really hard all the time and spent every ounce of effort and money that he had making work. Because he did really believe in his own greatness.
I think that's true of, don't you think the same about yourself?
No, I really don't. I don't have that. Some people have that. I just think like, wow, it's pretty lucky I can, I've got a few ideas and I can work them into them, but I'm not like, oh my God.
Well, I think there are a lot of artists
Who do
have
that? Yeah,
and are
that's
very
great.
successful because of it, or I don't know if that's
Yeah.
why. I wish an artist would run for president. Maybe you could do that next, Jack.
Hi. I just wanted to ask about the early part of his year, and I suppose of his life, sorry, and how aspects of his life fed into his work, like his really troubled life, and went through terrible things. But I just wonder how much, when he was making work and when he had this seemingly like really strong split in his personality of, like you're saying, kind of fragility around his disability and not moving to New York, but at the same time being very convinced of his own genius. I just wonder how his early life and how, turning tricks and how that fed in, and whether it constantly fed in or whether once he was at art school that kind of was put away somehow. I mean, I would imagine it always feeds into the work, but I wonder how vocal he was about that.
Oh, no, he was into it. He knew it was a good story and
Okay.
that it was, he wasn't ashamed of any of that. And I don't think he thought of himself as having a hard life, really.
Okay.
I mean, I guess I think he really wished he hadn't been shot, but he didn't, he didn't operate off
Okay, so
that,
it wasn't
but-
like it wasn't like a kind of trauma ongoing.
I'm sure it
was.
was on some level,
Yeah.
but it wasn't anywhere close to the surface of his consciousness. He just,
He was very much mythologizing it too, no?
yeah, I think it's a good story. A good story helps too, like with the Legacy and Archive. Like,
Myth is more powerful than anything. Money, art,
yeah.
everything.
You have another one? Oh.
Oh, thank you.
You're very nice, thanks. wrap it up.
So if there are any more questions, we'll take one more. Sarah? Yeah.
I mean, does it make sense to ask, how much material from him, is there any material on the market? I mean, is that you were talking about, people buying these at the Gramercy Fair?
No, everything is in
Everything.
the
Well,
archive.
there's
Well,
a
it's not true.
few floating around.
There's
quite a
Pat,
few.
Pat,
Yeah.
there's
Pat did
work.
sell some of the work in the shows
Right.
that she had.
Right,
so-
like you mentioned
yes.
at the which must have been the Gramercy at that time in
Yeah.
the hotel
No,
fair.
no, it was the first year of the Armory Show in the Armory.
Okay.
After the Gramercy International.
But that's what I'm saying. I think she had Polaroids at the chateau for like $250 in the first years of those.
Oh,
things.
maybe she was
And
selling
people
for
bought
$100.
groups and-
Yes.
There is quite a few of the sandwich prints around, like in New York and also on the West Coast. You feel, in,
Yeah,
you
there's
know,
that fella that
around
has
your
a bunch,
galleries
yeah.
a lot.
And
And-
most museums, I think, by now have one or two or something like that. I mean, the Whitney has a lot.
Oh, they do?
Yeah. He was in that
didn't know
first
that, yeah.
post-age show, I think.
And also in European collections in Hamburg is very well representing the Gala collection. But once this foundation thing is through, there will be decisions to be made. What Jack mentioned also. So, quite a few of the sandwich prints do not have the framing of the texts. So, but then there's also sandwich prints being in collections or outside, so to say, the estate, which are not framed with text or additional ornaments, so to say. So the question is, which of the existing prints in the estate have the status of a full work? All of those decisions should be made. The Polaroids is a different question. All the experiments, the cyano prints and the collages, and they have not. There's almost nothing in the world except for the estate. But
My
it
guess
is there's quite a lot of material.
There is in the archive. My guess is that it all qualifies as the work by now.
That is.
That all of it qualifies as the work. There are some that are finished, but I think even the unfinished ones are good enough to.
No, they look. You see. Remember that print of the breast with the tattoo on it,
Yeah.
and there is no version, as far as I know, for example, which has additional text. So he also released prints
Right,
without the signature Mark Morrisroe thing of writing around, and.
So, Beatrix, will you do a Mark Morrisroe show at the Stedelijk?
Well, what you see?
Probably has one of the greatest collections of modern and contemporary art in Europe or anywhere in the world, for that matter. It's a fantastic museum. It's very exciting that you're its director now. Thank you to Beatrix and to Jack and to all of you for coming. I hope we all take something new away from this. I actually learned something sitting here. And I'm glad to have interest in Mark's work renewed. So thank you, Beatrix, and thank you to EXPO Chicago.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you all for coming.